Hey everybody, we're going to do kind of a 20-minute little lecture on Greece, so we won't get through this whole long PowerPoint, but we'll get through some of it. What I really want to establish is kind of like classical Greece and set that up for us. And I think if you watch it before our next class, it'll help you on our in-class writing that we did about the Iliad that we read, okay? And so let's go ahead and get started. So Greece in the ancient world, we've already studied Bronze Age Greece, we've already studied the Mycenaean period, so let's get into classical Greece. So, a couple of terms you need to know here. First of all, the term of polis, P-O-L-I-S. Polis is the name of a Greek city-state. You read that in your textbook as well. And so that's just the name of the city-state. Now, if you think about it, polis is a suffix that's used a lot in English today, and it refers to a city, Annapolis, Metropolis, where Superman's from, Indianapolis, all those places. So polis is a suffix we still use today to mean city, and so the city-state is the polis. Athens was a polis, Sparta was a polis. Now, as we looked at with the Mycenaean city-state, right, Mycenae, we looked at that drawing that had like the large wall around the end of it, but then the city kind of rose up on a hill, and at the top of the hill was another walled-in area, and we discussed how the most important buildings of the city-state would be located on that hill, the temples, the treasury, the government buildings. That hill actually has a name, and the name is the Acropolis, okay? So the polis is the city, and the Acropolis is the highest point of the city, where they would have the most important buildings and do the most important things. When we talk Acropolis with Greece, we're mostly talking about the city of Athens. It becomes the most famous Acropolis. And we'll talk about the Acropolis of Athens and what's on it. But know that Acropolis is also kind of a term referring to all city-states that had the large hill with all the important buildings on it. Okay? Now, remember we said that Greece was a very mountainous area, so there was no empire of Greece for much of its history. And so you have many different cities with many different styles of governments, right? So the styles of governments that we see in Greece, we have an aristocracy. And an aristocracy is made up of the ruling families. And again, nobility, aristocracy is really how you're born, right? If you're born to a wealthy class, and that determines your status in society. So, I mean, maybe you can compare it to a Hindu caste system that we studied, but it's the same type of thing. And so there are some city-states out there that are ruled by families that were the original families of the city or considered noble for one reason or another, and so they run the show as kind of maybe an upper class. Now, we have an oligarchy, which is similar to an aristocracy, but it's not based on birth. An oligarchy is a city that is run by the most important people in the town. It could be birth, but it also could be the businessmen who are the wealthiest or the warriors who have the most power. And so it's not necessarily based on your family. It's more based on your accomplishments. But it's the same style of government, just a small group at the top running the city. We're going to talk about Athens. Athens is what we consider to be a direct democracy, and we'll discuss what that means. And then we have Sparta, and Sparta is a military communist state. Okay, so it's interesting to use those terms in the ancient world, democracy in the ancient world. We haven't really talked about democracy in the ancient world. We haven't talked about communism in the ancient world as well. And so we're going to compare those two. And when you talk about ancient Greece, whether it's in this class or another survey class that you take here in college, you will, one of the things to do in these classes is compare the city-states of Athens and Sparta, because they are the two of the most important city-states, and they also are very different. So it's interesting to compare those two. All right? Okay, so we start with the military. And it's interesting, why would you start talking about Greek culture with the military? Well, we're gonna discuss why. The idea is the hero ethic, right? The idea that you are you are the strongest, you are the best, you are the greatest warrior. That was heavily revered by the Greek city-states. And so sacrifice, loyalty, patriotism, you could even say, were virtues that many Greek city-states prized. And so it is kind of a modern idea of the way we feel about nationalism today. It was kind of born in Greece. Remember, we talked about at the beginning how so many of our institutions in the West, we base off of Greece and the Greek model. Well, this is one of them, the idea of how we feel about our nations and how we feel about fighting for our countries, right, was kind of born in Greece, the idea of nationalism, right? So here's what happens. During the Bronze Age, we talked about the Mycenaeans in the Bronze Age. Bronze was an expensive metal. I mean, you had to like buy it and make it. And so the armies back then were equipped by wealthy kings. The wealthy kings would have the weapons, the wealthy kings would supply their armies, and then they would fight. And so if you're an average guy, you don't really have a lot of weapons because you can't afford weapons. But then we move from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. And what's interesting about the Iron Age, we've discussed this before, is that iron is more plentiful, which makes it less expensive, but it also is a better weapon. It holds its edge better. It's a harder metal. And so once you learn how to melt that, once you learn how to get your blast furnace hot enough to melt iron and make tools and weapons out of iron, it changes society completely, right? And it changes the military as well. Now weapons are affordable. Now weapons are cheap. More people can have weapons, so armies become larger in the West, right? And so armies, instead of being a king supplying an army, a professional army that runs off of the money that the king supplies them and the weapons the king supplies them, any citizen can have weapons. You can have a spear, a sword, you can have a shield, you can have a helmet, right? And so what we start to see here, and this is a very modern idea, is the idea of a citizen army. An army that is made up of not professional soldiers, but soldiers that are also farmers, and soldiers that are also blacksmiths, and soldiers that also do other jobs besides fight. So fighting is a part-time job, and their full-time job is something else. But they do have to train. So they get together during, if you want to use a National Guard analogy, one weekend out of a month. And they take all weekend long and they train for war, right? And then they go back to their homes and do their jobs. Very similar to the beginning of the United States with the Revolutionary War and the militias. The militias had a musket over the fireplace, and all you had to do was call on someone, and the farmer becomes a soldier. The shopkeeper becomes a soldier. He's a Minuteman. He's a militia. Well, this is the same thing we're talking about in ancient Greece, but instead of a musket over the fireplace, we have a spear over the fireplace. And that spear can be grabbed, and the armor, you can put that on, and then you go out, and all of a sudden, you're not a farmer or a potter anymore. You are a soldier, right? And that also tends to speak to the patriotism of the period, right? You fight for your city-state. You're not fighting for a king. You're not fighting for nobility. You're fighting for your homes and your families. And so that's a modern element of warfare that we're familiar with, the idea of patriotism and fighting for our homes. So these soldiers, these citizen soldiers who could afford these iron weapons and who fought for the city-state, they were called hoplites, okay? H-O-P-L-I-T-E. And it was the term for the shield, actually, of the Greek warrior, and becomes the term for the Greek warrior himself, right? And the shield is going to be the main part of the strategy of fighting, right? Now, the phalanx is the organization, the fighting strategy that the Greeks used, right? And this is another thing that kind of sort of lends itself to the modern era, the idea of working together as a team, working together as an army, and having a strategy or a battle plan, right? And so we'll talk about the phalanx more in class. I'd like to do a little project with you in class about that. But let's look at it together. Okay, so here's a picture of the phalanx. What you want to try to do is you have these round shields. The shield covers everything from the shoulder down to the thigh. And you want to stand in a row and overlap your shields like you see here, right? And so you create a shield wall. And that shield wall moves forward, right? And you have your spear above your head here. Everyone is right-handed, right? If you're not right-handed, they make you right-handed. And you push forward and you jab as you push. Okay, you jab and push and jab and push. I think I'm doing that the opposite way, but you know what I mean. And even so, if you're in the front line, that's your job. But even if you're in the second or third line of the phalanx, you still have a very important job. And your job is to push the person in front of you, right? So your shield goes into the small of their back, and you push them forward as they stab, right? So there's no stopping for the people in the front row. If they stop, if they fall, they get trampled, right? And so they must continue to move forward because they're being pushed by the second line, that's pushed by the third line and the fourth line, and so on. And so you have to imagine a square, probably about 6 wide and 8 deep, that makes up this phalanx, depending on how large your city-state is. If you have the larger city-state, you'll have a larger phalanx. Smaller city-states will have a smaller phalanx, but it's made up of the same rows of men with their overlapping shields and their spears, right? And so you push together toward the enemy, and you smash into the enemy, right? And you keep stabbing and pushing until one person runs away, and that's a battle. So here's what we have with warfare in the Greek world. two cities that face off against each other. Maybe it's over land or it's over an insult or something like that. And so they get together and they say, we're going to meet here at a certain time. Get your phalanx, I'll get my phalanx. And so you show up, you get your squares together, and you move against each other, and you essentially smash against each other till one of the phalanxes falls and the other wins. Now, if this guy right here is stabbed and he falls, the man behind him must take his place. What happens if the man doesn't take his place? Well, the guy in front who's stabbing is going to create a gap in the line. And that gap is going to get wider and wider if it's not filled in. And eventually this phalanx will lose and the other phalanx will win. This made battle short in the ancient Greek world, but it also made it very vicious and very bloody. But the key is this. You want to be as good as anyone else on this line. You don't want to be the weak link. You want to pull your weight and do your job. You want to be heroic, right? And to be heroic means that you are part of the phalanx. You never break formation and you do your job, right? And that is the hero that all Greek citizens want to be. They want to be that person who saves the day by doing their job, by doing their duty for their city-state. Okay, so as we said before, the city-states would train maybe once a month, periodically, to get good at marching together and turning together and using their shields and stabbing. They would practice all that stuff before going into a real battle, right? And as we said, short, bloody battles. The stronger phalanx. The phalanx was based on teamwork and never breaking formation. If the formation was broken, then it was over. And the idea is the chain is only as strong as its weakest link, and you don't want to be the weak link. Right, you want to be the strong link. And this became the philosophy of Western military strategy. If you look at warfare throughout history of America and Europe, it's this idea, the idea that we're going to get our armies together and we're going to smash against each other until one army is defeated and the other army can claim victory. I mean, if you want a great example of this, look at the American Civil War. The North and the South spend 4 years trying to get the other army into open field so they can destroy it and then ask for peace. That's the Greek model. That's what the Greeks tried to do the entire history of Greece, right? Okay, so our first, and we'll talk about the military thing in class. I want to, like I said, I want to do a little project with you to help visualize it, right? But keep all that in mind. Now, Athens is the first city we talk about. Athens was an old city. During the Bronze Age, there was an Athens. Athens began after it came out of the Bronze Age into the Iron Age as an aristocracy. So it was ruled by a group of families that were considered the noble families of the city, right? And when you have a city-state like this, it's not surprising that the laws would favor the wealthy. The laws would favor the rich people. And so one law in particular that was very unpopular with the Athenians, common people, was the idea of debt slavery. And debt slavery is exactly what it is, what it sounds like. You are a common person who owes money to a wealthy person, and that wealthy person has the right to enslave you until you pay that debt back. So if you're a poor farmer and you're trying to bring your crop in to feed your family and pay your taxes, but you owe a wealthy guy money, that wealthy guy can enslave you to work on his farm while your farm, goes, your crops rot while his crops go into, and make him money. And so this is not really a fair system, but it's a system that favored the wealthy. But you can imagine this is going to cause a lot of problems with the commoners. They're not going to like this very much, right? So debt slavery and the other injustices that dealt with land and land ownership caused a lot of problems in Athens and eventually caused a rebellion from the bottom up. The people of Athens will rebel against the wealthy people because of debt slavery and other unfair practices of the rich. And so first of all, we have one of the nobility step up and say, okay, we'll solve this problem. We'll make the commoners happy. And his name was Draco. Okay, so Draco, there's the 621 BCE. Draco is known as the lawgiver. He was a member of a ruling family of Athens. He created the first legal code, which gave more rights to property to poor people, and it protected contracts. So if you sign a contract, you had to adhere by that contract, but it did not repeal debt slavery. So it doesn't get rid of the real problem. So what we're going to have is later down the road, you'll have another rebellion. So 621 BC, Draco kicks the can down the road, if you will, right? Then again, in 594, another rebellion occurs because there's still debt slavery, and another noble comes to power, Solon, in 594. And Solon takes the step to outlaw debt slavery and to give all citizens the right to participate in government. Any citizen can bring a charge against another citizen, regardless of if they're wealthy or poor. And he also passed economic reforms. And so Solon really took the process forward as far as giving the poor and the commoners more rights so that they'll be happy. And remember, this is all based on the idea that there are more poor people than wealthy people. And if the poor people realize that united, they are actually stronger than the aristocracy, then that gives them a lot of power. And this is what makes Athens unique. Athens is a city-state where the poor and the commoners have that realization that if they were united, then they can overpower the wealthy, right? Okay, so Solon takes it a little further in 594. But during this period of time, Athens experiences an economic revolution. Let me explain. Athens, in the ancient world, had large olive groves that were all around the city. And so the main agricultural product of Athens was olives. And it was some of the best olive oil in the ancient world. Now, why is olive oil so special? Well, in the ancient world, it was used like we use it today at Olive Garden to dip bread in, but it was also used as a lubricant. It was used on machines. It was used in many different ways besides food. And so the Athenians could export olives out to other parts of the Mediterranean, to Greek colonies, as well as to Egypt, as well as to Persia, and they started to make lots of money. So what you have are your farmers, your poor farmers, your common farmers, that begin to get money from this economic boom that is the olive trade of Athens, right? Now this causes people to want nicer things. We're going to talk about this in class. This revolutionizes pottery and pottery painting. It also makes Athens a pretty wealthy city. But when people have more money and they also fight because they're citizen soldiers, they start to want more say in other things like government. They say, look, if we're willing to die for our city-state as a hoplite, if we have money and means on our own and we have our own land, then why can't we help you rule? Why can't we have a piece of that pie as well? Now, along comes a man who's also a noble. His name is Pisistratus, right? And Pisistratus becomes the first tyrant of Athens. So, if I ask you to name a tyrant from history, you'll probably come up with some pretty negative terms like Hitler or Mussolini or a dictator, an evil dictator like that. But the original meaning of tyrant didn't really have any bad connotation at all. The original meaning simply is someone who rules with the support of the people. And Pisistratus' story is pretty interesting. He creates I wouldn't say he tricks people, but he creates a situation where people believe that he's been appointed by the gods to rule over the city. And the people believe him, right? And so what Pisistratus does is he takes the support of the people and he goes to the aristocracy and says, look, you're going to put me in charge of the city, and if you don't, the commoners that outnumber you will rise up and overthrow you anyway, and I'll be leader of the city. So the aristocracy really has no choice but to put Pisistratus in charge, right? And so in order to get the people behind him, Pisistratus has to promise them things. Lower taxes, more rights in government, more land ownership, all those things, right? And he follows through. He creates massive building projects. He gets rid of unemployment. He lowers people's taxes. He gives them more buying power, more land, more rights. And we're on the road to democracy, and this is getting us close here with Pisistratus, right? But then Pisistratus dies, and the aristocracy try to take back the power they lost under Pisistratus. That was their plan, right? They want to take back what they've lost. And so then we have this civil war in Athens between the aristocracy, who wants to take things back to the way they were, and the commoners who want to keep the rights that they've been given by Pisistratus. And what's even more convoluted about this is the Spartans get involved, right? And so the aristocracy allies with the Spartans, and the Spartans come and try to take over the city, and the people have to rise up. It's a long story. So here are the leaders of Athens, right? We have Draco on the left, yes, and we have Solon in the middle, and we have Pisistratus on the right. I think these might be Roman copies, so we don't know if this is what they actually look like, but this is the idea of the Greek leader, right? The leader of Athens. Okay. After the Civil War is over, after the aristocracy lose and the people rise up, the people choose a leader, and that leader is Cleisthenes. And Cleisthenes was a relative of Pisistratus through marriage. He had been involved in Pisistratus' government. He was exiled during the Civil War. They invite him back, and Cleisthenes is the one who's going to create the democracy that we'll know, right? So he seized power with the support of the people, and he worked to break the power of the nobility. And here's what he does. He creates a council of 500. And the council of 500 is made up of 500 Athenian men chosen at random. So they put everybody's names in a pot and they draw them out, right? And they say, okay, you guys will be in charge of our government. You guys will be in charge of making laws. So since they were chosen randomly, it didn't mean that the wealthy were in charge. It meant that all citizens, rich, poor, middle class, were helping make laws. Now, any Athenian citizen could go at any time and be involved in lawmaking, but these guys, for 1 year, were the professional lawmakers, right? Now, here's the problem. If you are a shopkeeper and you are chosen to be one of the 500, who's going to open your shop? Who's going to sell your things? If you're a wealthy landowner, you can have your slaves do it. You could go every day to the government. But if you're a working man, who's going to work for you while you have while you make laws? Well, Cleisthenes came up with an idea of a salary. So this is the first example that we have in the West of a paid public servant, right? So he gave the Council of 500 money so that they could pay someone to work for them while they made these laws. And so you have the first salary, all right? So, like I said, any citizen of Athens could come and debate laws and discuss laws, but these were the 500 full-time lawmakers for the year. And here's how it worked. Let's say, for example, that you are an Athenian citizen. You're a farmer and you live kind of outside the city a few miles on your farm. And you hear that they're having a large vote over an issue, right? And so you don't want to miss the vote. And you don't have a chance to go to the city very much or to vote in different type of elections. But you want to go today because it's a very important vote. So you show up at the city and you are given a black rock and a white rock at some point. So you go into the city and there are people giving speeches. And so you listen to this speech about how you want to vote yes for the law, and this speech how you want to vote no for the law. You get the information that you want, and you go up to the place where they vote, the government building, I guess. It'd probably be outside, kind of an amphitheater type thing. And you'd listen to the closing arguments, and finally it would be time to vote. You take your black rock and your white rock, and you stand in line. And you walk past these large pots, these large vases, right? And you drop your black rock into the vase if you want to say no, and you drop your white rock into the vase if you want to say yes. After everyone has voted, they dump out the rocks and they count the black and white rocks to determine if the law passed. And you have the first democratic system, right? Now, this is a direct democracy because all citizens have the right to vote for laws, okay? We, in America, do not have a direct democracy because it is impossible for all of Americans to go to Washington, D.C. and vote on laws. So we have a representative government where we vote for people to go for us to vote on laws, and hopefully they will vote like we want them to. But Athens was small enough to give every citizen a right to come and have their say and vote for laws on their own without having to elect anyone, and that is direct democracy. Now let's keep in mind, this was only the men of Athens. It didn't include foreigners, it didn't include slaves, it didn't include women. And so we're not talking about this great, enlightened society. But it is. It is the first example we have in the West of people making their own laws and living by their own laws. And that was done by Cleisthenes. Okay? And there is Cleisthenes again, a likeness of Cleisthenes. That he was the creator of democracy in Athens. All right, so here's what we're going to do. I'm going to stop there, okay? And we're going to talk about Sparta next time, okay? And then we're going to compare the two, and then we'll talk about the Persian Wars. And so this is a good place to stop. Let's cut it off there, and then we'll pick back up later on with Sparta. That can be a separate video, all right?